thank you for joining us on the 6th day of the 20th anniversary edition of the Hong Kong International Literary Festival. My name's Jo Lusby and I'm one of the directors of the festival board. We've already had 5 days of online and hybrid events, and we'll be running online events all week until Sunday, the 15th of November. If you're in Hong Kong, you can also attend events live at Asian Society and Tai Kwun next weekend. Visit our website, festival.org.hk, for further details. We're delighted to be joined today by author Barbara Demick to speak about her book, Eat the Buddha, the story of modern Tibet through the people of one town, and by Lindsey Hilsum, international editor of Channel 4 News, who is literally just back in London from covering the US election. I'll hand over to Lindsey in a minute. First, though, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping points about Crowdcast. First, feel free to post comments in the chat on the right-hand side of the screen. If you have questions for the speakers, you can put them in the Q&A box at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. Click on the green button at the bottom of your screen at any time, and you'll be connected to the website of the festival bookseller Bookazine, where you can buy both Barbara and Lindsey's books. All of our authors are appearing for free, and the best way to thank them and support our work is to buy their books. And meanwhile, you could also be supporting a local retailer, which is also very good. The event will remain on Crowdcast until the end of November, so you can watch on demand at any time until then. Today's event is in English, and within 48 hours, there'll be Chinese subtitles added to the version. Finally, I'd like to thank all of our cultural partners and sponsors and donors for their generous support, which make all of these events possible. We'd also like to acknowledge an ongoing grant from the Standing Committee on Language Education and Research. And now I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, Lindsey Hilsum. Lindsey is the international editor of Britain's Channel 4 News and the author of In Extremis, The Life of War Correspondent Mary Colvin. She's covered many of the conflicts and refugee movements of the past 3 decades, including Syria, Libya, Ukraine, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Kosovo, as well as the 2016 US election and the terror attacks in Europe. From 2006 until 2008, she was based in China, and in 1994, she was the only English-speaking foreign correspondent in Rwanda when the genocide started. She's won several awards and contributes to newspapers and literary magazines. I'm going to hand over to Lindsey to introduce Barbara, and I very much hope you enjoy the conversation. I'm sure I will, and I'll see you at the next event. Thanks, Lindsey.
Thank you very much, Jo, for that kind introduction. And let's welcome Barbara Demick. Now, Barbara, I have known since we were both in China in just before the Olympics then. And she became very well known, not just as the LA Times correspondent, but because of her book on North Korea, Nothing to Envy, which won the Samuel Johnson Award. And it really was an extraordinary and unique insight into life in North Korea. And she has a particular technique which involves very intense reporting, spending a huge amount of time with people and in places. And that's how she gets to a depth of reporting that very few others do. And she has employed the same technique with this, her new book, Eat the Buddha, the story of modern Tibet through the people of one town, that one town being Naba. So, Barbara, welcome to the Hong Kong Literary Festival. Congratulations on your book. Before we go any further, actually, do you want to just show the book to our audience here so they can see it? Do you have it there?
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction, Lizzie. There's 2, but this is the US cover, and it's a bit bleak, but it shows Kirti Monastery, which is the monastery in Naba, which is the center of most of the
center of the book. Thank you.
Just for reference, the British edition, which is
the British one. I prefer the British one. The British one is a bit more, has got a bit more energy to it, hasn't it?
It's a bit more cheerful. I would not thought the Brits are so much more optimistic than us, but
listen, what really struck me, Barbara, when I read this book, because I've read quite a few books on Tibet, as I'm sure many people in our audience have, and you get these 2 contradictory narratives, don't you? You get the Chinese narrative, which comes down from the government, that, you know, the life of the Tibetan people is being improved by the Chinese Communist Party. And then you get the narrative from a lot of them Western well-wishers, people who may have become Buddhists themselves, who say, you know, it's just all awful and they are the most oppressed people in the world. your book didn't really do either of those things, did it? What were you trying to do?
Thank you. That's a very intelligent observation, because it is part of what I'm trying to do. I mean, Tibet has been for many years kind of lost in the fog of propaganda, really propaganda on all sides. And I try to just present the facts, what happened, and let people tell the story. And then I try to verify that what they experienced is true. But I really avoid words like genocide and evil and colonialism. I did the same thing with my North Korea book. I didn't say these people are evil and blah, 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 blah. I just said, this is what happened. And so, in this book, Tibetans are telling their story of what happened in their hometown since the 1950s when the book opens. And, I let, readers make their judgment. And I mean, this is a technique that some writers have used for years. John Hersey, who is one of my writing teachers at Yale, did this in Hiroshima. He didn't say the horror, he said, and then the skin peeled off. And well, I won't go on, but
I think that what's very interesting about it is it's not, yes, just the facts, but it is the facts very much through the eyes of the people you talk to, isn't it? It's their stories as they present them. So tell us a bit about the place that you chose to write this book in, Naba, and why you chose it.
This is an unusual place, and by the way, some of the people listening may know it as Abba, which is the Chinese pronunciation, sort of like the Swedish band, and also it appears in some English sources as Abba. It also appears as Noah. It's a rather elusive place. Naba, as I'm pronouncing it, is on the sort of the eastern part of the Tibetan plateau. It's in Sichuan province. And as this audience may know, but others don't, less than half of the Tibetan plateau is the Tibet Autonomous Region. If you go to these parts of Sichuan, Yunnan, Qinghai, Gansu, it looks Tibetan. There's the yaks and there's the nomads and there's the people in Chuba. It's like Tibetan, but it's not part of the official Tibet. And actually, the majority of Tibetans live outside of the official Tibet. You meet a Tibetan in New York, certainly. A lot of Tibetans in New York. Most of them are from this area. And so I felt like this was kind of the real Tibet in some ways. Tourists usually go to Lhasa or Shigatse or Mount Kailash if they're lucky, and it's hard for journalists to go there, but a lot of tourists go, and there's a million pictures, and it's lovely, and the coffee table books. But this is kind of a real nitty-gritty, nothing Tibetan town that, as it happened, became kind of the epicenter of the Tibetan resistance. But it's a pretty ordinary place.
And how did you get in there? Because as you say, it's very difficult for journalists to get to Lhasa and to the Tibetan Autonomous Region. But even in this area, which is, China proper, if we can call it that, it's still not easy to get in and to report in the kind of depth that you did, because, there's a lot of Chinese government people watching, aren't there, all the time?
Yeah, this is true. And, I was, as you were, Lindsey, I was an accredited card-carrying, not party card, but press card-carrying journalist in Beijing. So we were, especially in the post-Olympics period, told, we could go anywhere in China, except for the Tibet Autonomous Region. And so on paper, Naba was open. There was nothing illegal about going there. I didn't sneak in. Our bureau was very mindful of, following the laws of China as an accredited bureau. And sometimes you would be told on the ground, you can go there, no problem. We would call the Diplomatic Service Bureau, the Foreign Ministry, and then you would get there and there'd be a checkpoint. And I'm sure this happened to you many times.
It certainly did. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes it was reporting an innocuous story. I mean, this happened to me when I did go to Yangzhou, where Xi Jinping was sent down during the Cultural Revolution. We had to like drive around the checkpoints to get in to find people who actually told us how wonderful he was and what a hard worker he was. But there's a knee-jerk thing when you get to the ground of people not wanting to let you in, and that was certainly the case in Naba. It had a reputation for years and years as a place that foreigners could not visit. Foreigners who were related to Tibetans inside, foreigners who were selling things, or not just journalists. And there were always checkpoints. There was an informal rule against non-Chinese checking into hotels. I didn't sneak in, but I would go in discreetly. I'm sort of I can be kind of a nondescript person. And I didn't have like a big, television crew with me.
Oh, I'm so jealous.
Yeah, and I would sit in the back of a taxi and, wear my hat low, or sometimes a face mask, because a lot of people did there for the dust and the sun. And, unlike some friends of ours, our like tall blonde friend Holly Williams, who went in.
Yeah, who would be really noticed.
Yeah,
I have to say, it's one of the things which I enjoy about when I'm reporting in Iran or some Muslim countries. You just you put your headscarf on, and then you know what? You're any old middle-aged woman, and nobody suspects a middle-aged woman of being a journalist and trying to find out things which are difficult, do they?
Yeah. You wear, crappy clothes, leave the North Face, then the Gore-Tex behind, and so I mean that was really how I traveled, usually by car, usually in a Chinese car. I tended to work with Chinese drivers rather than Tibetan drivers, because, one of the fears you have as a journalist, especially back then, is that you're going to get other people in trouble who are working with you.
But one of the things a lot of the testimony or the characters in the book are based overseas, and so you sort of went between. And I suppose the most sort of obviously fascinating person is Gonpo, the princess. Can you tell us a bit about Princess Gonpo? Maybe give us a bit of a reading about her as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, one of my main people in the book, and I open with Gonpo, is a princess. Her father was the last king of Naba. Something that most people don't understand is that this part of Tibet had a lot of local rulers for hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, it was nominally under Chinese control, under the control of the Qing Empire for many years, but they didn't really exert control. And in 1958, really when things started. And I'll read the very beginning here. This opens, and this girl is 7 years old. And just a short reading. Gampa could smell the smoke before she could see what was happening. Although she was just 7 years old and not well versed in the politics of the day, it confirmed a nagging feeling she'd had for weeks that something was amiss. She was on her way home with her mother, sister, and aunt and a convoy of servants. They had been away attending the funeral rituals for her uncle. It had been summer when they set out for her uncle's village, but they had been away for 49 days, the traditional mourning period between death and rebirth for Buddhists. Now it was early autumn, and the evening chill whispered of the snow that would soon creep down from the mountaintops. Gampo wore a thick sheepskin robe trimmed with fur, for the wind whipped up from underneath her horse and made her shiver. Everybody was on horseback. Gampo, like most Tibetans, was a seasoned equestrian at a young age. They followed the course of a road that had been recently laid out by the Chinese military engineers, and although not yet paved, it headed due west straight into the setting sun. The route forked off at a stream that led north to Gampo's home, and as they emerged from behind a thicket of shrubbery, Gampo could see where the smoke was coming from. From her vantage point atop the horse, she had a clear view of a half-dozen bonfires and a corresponding number of tents. As they approached, she could see that these weren't the black yak hair tents used by Tibetans, but the small white tents of the People's Liberation Army. I will, I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit, but
Yeah.
This was 1958, 9 years after Mao Zedong had proclaimed the People's Republic of China, so it was not unusual to see encampments of the Red Army around the countryside, but this was on her family property. Gampo had been fighting off sleep the last leg of the journey, but she was now jolted awake by curiosity. She slipped off her horse, and without waiting for the servants to help her, she ran up to the gate. She banged hard. There was no response, so she shouted at the top of her lungs, "Hello, hello, where is everybody?" Eventually, Gampo's nanny came and unlocked the gate. Instead of a warm welcome, the maid leaned over the child as if she wasn't there, bringing her face close enough to Gampo's mother to whisper directly into her ear. Gampo couldn't hear the words, but she discerned from her mother's reaction that it couldn't be good. Gampo had seen her mother crying a lot lately. She thought maybe her mother was grieving the uncle who had died recently. At least Gampo wanted to believe that, in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, the smoke, the tent, the stone-faced maid. But her instinct told her this was different. This was the beginning of the end of the world as she knew it.
And it was the beginning of the end of the world as she knew it, wasn't it? I mean, tell us a bit of the context. What was she was this puzzled 7-year-old girl. She didn't understand what was happening around her. What was happening around her?
What was happening around her is that the Chinese government was moving into this part of eastern Tibet. After the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, there was an agreement that was signed, the 17th Agreement, which was really, this might resonate with you in Hong Kong, really the original one country, two systems agreement. It said basically, Tibet is part of China, but it will have its own system. And Lindsey Hilsum wrote a lovely piece about the parallels between Hong Kong and Tibet.
That's interesting. Yeah, maybe we'll come back to that. I should just interrupt. I was going to say, if people want to ask questions, do press the question button there, and we can come to that. And and obviously the parallels with Hong Kong are very interesting.
Yeah, but just in terms of what was happening now, because I'm answering this too slowly, this agreement did not apply to Eastern Tibet, which is where most Tibetans live. And in 1958, they moved in. They moved in very quickly and basically confiscated all the land, kicked out the local rulers, or at least tried to co-opt them, forced people into communes, took away their animals, closed the monasteries, disrobed the monks. And it was very brutal. It was really, really brutal. And this was happening in Eastern Tibet, not in the Tibet Autonomous Region. And just a quick bit of history. It was these, and this was, also coincided with the Great Leap Forward, this period of great famine. Right. And it was so brutal. And it was, the Communist Party was not high up on the learning curve at this point. Later, I think they figured some things out. And there was mass starvation, mass death, people dying in prisons. And a lot of these people from Eastern Tibet went, escaping and running to Lhasa, fearing for their lives. And that was part of the uprising that led to the flight of the Dalai Lama in 1959. But when this started in 1958, it was so horrible that Tibetans in this area just referred to 58 the way the Americans talk about 911. If you say 58, it's, the year that time collapsed, the earth fell, the Nakba in the Middle East, it's the year of disaster. And
how much does that still resonate with people in the town of Naba or Aba today? I mean, how much is 1958 present in their minds and their lives?
Very, very much present. And, there's this there's a lot of talk these recent years about, epigenetics and genetic trauma and trauma that is passed on through generations. And, I don't use these words in the book because I avoid them, but this was, like a Holocaust for these people. And it's made it hard to achieve really, these are what the Chinese would call harmonious society in this area, because everybody has, a parent, a grandparent who was lost. I mean, estimates 20-30% of the Tibetan population died in those years.
20 to 30%. That's horrendous.
Yeah, it was high, and of course, there were many Han Chinese who died in those years of famine.
Sure, and sure, many.
It happened to the Han Chinese. It happened worse to the Tibetans.
Right, and bring us back to Gonpo, because so there she is, and she is as the daughter of a king. Then obviously in that time of the Cultural Revolution, she is particularly reviled, right? Because she's I don't know what she's a feudal landlord, she's a capitalist rhoder, she's all of these phrases that we're familiar with, and yet she's just a little girl.
She's just a little girl, and at first things are, there's many different phases here. At first, so her family is kicked out of their palace, and they're sent to the capital of Sichuan province, and they live in sort of a kind of an ethnic minorities complex where at first things are very nice, and there's a lot of propaganda about we're all one nation and a lot of the ethnic harmony business. But then, it's always one thing after another. Then the Cultural Revolution starts in earnest in 1966. Now, a teenager. And at that point, her parents are both tormented to the point where they're either killed or commit suicide. It's hard to tell. Her only sister dies. She's at that point at the Minzu Dashui, the ethnic minorities school in Beijing, and she's tormented and beaten and eventually sent out to Xinjiang, where no surprise, she falls in love with a Chinese guy.
But that's what's so interesting about Gonpo, and I don't want to give away the entire story because I want people to buy the book and read it for themselves. But one of the things which I find fascinating about Gonpo is that she spans this complexity, doesn't she? Because of course she's a victim of everything that happened to Tibet and to Tibetans, and yet she sort of assimilates as well, doesn't she?
She does, and she's really a very interesting person, and she points to some of the subtleties that I found in the way many Tibetans look at their situation. She was educated in the Chinese system. She left Tibet when she was 7 years old, and then she was educated in Chinese. She was an excellent student. She was a true believer socialist.
Right.
She quoted from the Little Red Book, and she was, really, did not want to be royalty, didn't want to have money, didn't want to put herself forward. She was always volunteering, to serve the people. She really believed, and actually still does believe that. But she's also Tibetan, and there's an interesting affinity between some of the socialist, the idealistic early socialist thinking and Tibetan Buddhism, the abrogation of the self, the sharing, the compassion. She sort of, in her thinking, she has this, mishmash of Tibetan Buddhism and, very idealistic early socialism. And, she always, still to this day, I don't want to give away, sort of goes back and forth between loving China to some extent, but loving Tibet, her faith and her people and her language more. And, I see that in many of the people in the book. It's always,
Yeah, I was going to say that. Do you feel that that sort of duality in the people that you she met, because I think, again, if I come back to sort of a lot of the Western narrative about Tibet, it's very concentrated on the sort of spiritual side of Tibetan life and on being oppressed. And both these things are true. And yes, in your book, that is part of people's lives, but it's not, there's more than that. And it's not all anti-China, is it?
Yeah, I mean, everybody is conflicted, you know, I mean, just talking about us and politics. But, you know, many of these people are conflicted. And something I heard very often from Tibetans from Naba was that it's not the economy. You know, it's like we appreciate that China has improved the economy. We appreciate some of what they've done. But it's our freedom and our language and our culture. There's a man who I spent some time with in Naba, who's a successful businessman, and you know, he has, you know, a couple of cars, very nice cars, a couple of apartments, houses, and he says, you know, I have everything I want in life, but my freedom.
Right.
You know, he doesn't have a passport. He actually wants to go to Thailand, was the last I heard. You know, they can't travel. This is a big issue for Tibetans. Most Tibetans don't have passports, or if they have passports, they're allowed to go on one trip and then they have to turn in their passport. And it's very difficult at times for them to travel even within China. And, you know, I heard this from a lot of Tibetans, like, she talks about the Chinese dream. I want the Chinese dream, but I want the same privileges as other citizens of China. I want to be able to learn my own language. I want to, you know, be able to display the pictures that I want in my own home. I don't want to have to worry that they're going to come, you know, arrest me for displaying a picture of the Dalai Lama or extort money from me. I don't want to be forced, or I should say compelled, to put up a picture of Xi Jinping if I don't want to. I want to teach my kids Tibetan and Chinese, and, you know, I want to travel places, you know, and they don't have those same basic rights. I'm not talking about the Western democracy or any of that. I'm talking about, you know, if you live in Hunan province.
Anywhere else in Sichuan province, the Han Chinese in Sichuan province. What about, I mean, you just mentioned about pictures of the Dalai Lama. Now, obviously, for decades now, the Chinese government has demonized the Dalai Lama. And one of the things I remember from my own travels in Tibetan areas was that sort of moment when you talk to somebody and then they just very quietly show you that hidden under their clothing they're wearing a medallion of the Dalai Lama, or they take you into a house and they just show you hidden in a cupboard or something, that he's always there. And there's never, that they can't, whatever the Chinese Communist Party does, they can't get the Dalai Lama out of Tibetan people's hearts, can they? It's just always a presence. Is that what you found?
Always. And there's first of all, I'd say that it really varies depending on the time and the place. People are always saying to me, oh, I was in Yunnan province, I was in Shangri-La, there's plenty of pictures of the Dalai Lama. Some places it's allowed, some places it isn't. And they always joke, is like the Chinese communist party, like the weather, you know, it changes every day. And so people keep their pictures, you know, on a hook with a cord, and then you put it down, take it out, depending on the season. But there is a craziness about it, and it's very counterproductive, really, because they're always doing this peeping to criticize the Dalai Lama thing, and it's very offensive to Tibetans. I mean, it's not exactly like burning a Quran, but it's provocative and offensive. And in fact, Princess Gapa told me, she said, you know, I could accept Chinese rule, I could accept the Chinese Communist Party if they would just stop saying these things about the Dalai Lama. And, you know, I hear this, I hear this all the time from young Tibetans. In Lhasa, I mean, it's like zero tolerance.
Yeah.
Absolutely zero tolerance. But, you know, people told me that when you go into the monastery, you see a statue or an image of the Bodhisattva of compassion, who is Chenrezig in Tibetan, who is really the patron saint of Tibetans, and is Dalai Lama is a representative of him. So they say when they see that, it's like the Dalai Lama is there.
Right.
And there's a very funny scene. Can I go on about this?
Yes, do. Yes, please do. Yeah.
I mean, I've had some funny experiences with this. When I was a couple of years ago, I was flying from Nepal back to Beijing, and I was flying through Lhasa. Actually, it was the same day that the Malaysian plane went down, which I was almost on, but I won't go to that. But I decided to take a route that was from Kathmandu through Lhasa to Beijing. And when I was transiting through the airport in Lhasa, the only thing I had with me was a Lonely Planet Nepal guidebook. I figured this is like, an innocuous item. And when I went through, the guard looked at my bag. He saw the book. If I had more time, I'd pull it out. And he turned. He knew exactly which page to go to, and he turned. And there was one of those little historical sections, and it had a picture of the Dalai Lama that was like this big. And I could see this picture, without reading glasses. I mean, it was so small. And he said, absolutely not. And it was like, and you come on, shout, just have a shout. This is like, you're kidding. This is so small. And he had this like look on his face. Is like, he was Tibetan. Like, I know it's stupid. It's stupid, but like, let's just not argue about it. And, I just imagine they had like.
And did he confiscate the book or just tear out the page?
He confiscated the book. I told him to tear out the page because the book was like, like $25. It was expensive. I'm sure
they had. He must have so many copies that he must be selling to tourists on the way. Because
I'll get in one other Dalai Lama story.
Yes,
this is like the end of the book. When I went to Naba, and it was right before the Dalai Lama's 80th birthday. And I had I had interviewed the Dalai Lama a couple months before, and I had, the obligatory selfie on my iPhone.
Of course. Yeah.
And of course, everybody told me to delete it, but I didn't. So, being the idiot that I am, I was showing people the selfie, and I was like suddenly a rock star in Noah.
I bet.
Most popular, even, nobody in the government knew I was there, but Tibetans knew, and I had this picture. I was like very celebrated. I won't say that much more about it, but it was, I had seen the great man, and they knew I was with the LA Times, and the Dalai Lama was planning on spending his birthday in LA. And so as I was planning to leave, I had taken a Chinese car. I had a driver. All these young Tibetans came out saying, you have to bring some gifts to the Dalai Lama for his 80th birthday.
Oh, right.
And I was like, wait, I work for the LA Times, but I live in New York, and I'm like driving to Chengdu, I had like 6 flights to catch. And it was like, and they just like basically pried open the trunk of my car and were like throwing in sampa and herbs and momos, these dumplings, and like the whole car was.
And sampa, that like sort of what, sacks of grain?
Oh, it's the dried barley flour.
Yes, dried barley. Yes, exactly.
All this stuff. And I was like, and I was trying to explain my plane connections and my luggage allowance.
That's not going to work.
Yeah. So it was interesting to me because these people were very young and very, seemed very secular, and they weren't like activist types. They were, kind of some people involved in business and some of these Tibetans I met aren't even really believers. They don't really believe that each Dalai Lama is the reincarnation of the next, and but she is everything to them. Whether they're true believers in Tibetan Buddhism or it's just cultural. And, you know, they just melt. And, you know, I
so
found
what did you do with all those gifts?
Well, this is actually the end of the very last, ending of my book, but I was, you know, driving to Chengdu and I remembered that I had interviewed somebody in the region who was disabled and very poor.
Right.
And I drove by, knocked on her gate, and gave her the food. And as
I
say in the book,
to channel the Dalai Lama, but I think
that's exactly. I say in the book that I channeled my inner Dalai Lama, and you know, somebody from the Dalai Lama staff who read that section of the book said, that was the right thing to do.
Yeah. I'm not getting questions yet, so if people do want to put in questions, do press that ask a question button. Can I just bring you back to what you were saying about Hong Kong? Maybe we can explore that a little bit more, because I mean, it's so different, the relationship between Tibetans and the Chinese Communist Party and Hong Kong and China, but yet you were drawing out a parallel. Can you explain a bit more about what you mean by that?
Maybe I will read a little bit from Isabel Hilton's piece. Isabel Hilton did a wonderful book about the Panchen Lama.
Yes.
And I'll just read a few graphs and then I can
do. It's interesting.
Elaborate. This was a piece from the New Statesman, and she said, "History, as Mark Twain may have said, does not repeat, but it rhymes. Reading Barbara Demick's tragic history of one Tibetan town following recent events in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, there are no shortage of rhymes. The confrontation in Hong Kong have recently been compared to Tiananmen Square in 1989. In fact, the long and brutal process of subjugation of China's borderlands, including Tibet, may be a better analogy. There are many poignant echoes, beginning with a promise." This is what I talked about before. The 17-point agreement for peaceful liberation of Tibet was a treaty signed under duress by representatives of the Dalai Lama's government and the government of the People's Republic of China in 1951. Leaving aside why, if Tibet had always been part of China, as Beijing claims, the treaty was an appropriate instrument to sanctify a military invasion, the terms of the deal remain noteworthy. A promise to preserve internal autonomy and the government of the Dalai Lama in order to, sorry, I don't have my reading glasses, and promise that the government of the Dalai Lama can continue to order Tibet's domestic affairs, including but not limited to its religious practices, leaving Beijing to take care of borders and securities. It was an early version of the one country, two systems arrangement proposed by Deng Xiaoping and Margaret Thatcher in the early 1980s. It collapsed within 7 years.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? And how has the attitude to Tibet and Tibetans, and think about that, because we think about what's happened with Xi Jinping and Hong Kong. What difference has Xi Jinping's rule made in the Tibetan areas?
There has just been a lot more Chinese presence in the Tibetan areas. Lhasa 3 years ago, and I haven't written about this because I went as a...
Because it was sort of after your book, isn't it? Yeah.
You know, the Xi Jinping photos were everywhere, you know, in every cafe and on, you know, in many of the homes I visited. And it's just this, you know, pushing them to, you know, compelling them to put up these pictures. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't inspire a natural love. And I think, you know, I read and recently reviewed Joshua Wong's book for the New York Review of Books. And, you know, he says, you know, it's like a mother saying, you know, love me, love me, love me, love me. You know, you just recoil. So it can have it can really backfire. And no,
that's really interesting. I mean, one of the questions which has now come up, which I think is related to that, is somebody has asked, why has Aba or Naba been such a center for the self-immolations?
Yeah,
because of course that is something that has come up in the last the last few years, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And this is something we really need to get to. So Naba is really on the eastern edge of the Tibetan plateau, and it's a borderland, it's a collision point. And I've found in general, as a foreign correspondent, any place where you have a collision of cultures, Bosnia or Lebanon, you often have unrest, and trouble.
Yeah.
And that was true in Naba. But Naba is very interesting. It was one of the first places where Tibetans and Chinese communists encountered one another. It was during the Long March period. And the Red Army, at that time, a rebel army, not very idealistic, but not well equipped, not well provisioned, fleeing, the nationalists fled into the Tibetan plateau. And they were just like heading west and then north. And suddenly they were, at high elevation, no food, no local knowledge, didn't speak the language.
Right.
And we started basically, raiding Tibetan homes and monasteries to get food. And this is where the title of my book comes from. They found these small votive statues in the Tibetan monasteries. This is all around Naba, made of flour and butter. And they ate the statues. And some of this comes from Chinese memoirs from the period. I think one of the memoirs was by Wu Fa-shen, who became kind of a notable figure, where he said, we were eating the Buddha. And they knew it was bad, but they were hungry. And some of these Chinese soldiers actually left IOUs and notes of apology, but it set a very bad tone.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, this storyline runs through my book because Gampo, the princess I spoke to, her grandmother was then the ruler of Naba. Actually, Naba was a bit of a matriarchy. And rather than let the Chinese occupy their palace, she burnt down the palace and fled into the mountains. And she was an amazing woman.
So how does that, tell me how that fits in with the self-immolations, which is what's happening now.
So there was like a history of bad relations. And then the 1950s were very bad in Naba. In the 1960s, during the Cultural Revolution, Naba actually had a group of Tibetan Red Guards who also rose up. This was always whatever the cliche is, a restive place, but it was always, Naba was always a headache for the Communist Party. And the self-immolations started in Naba. And so there was a bit of a copycat effect. One, I mean, this is the nature of what we call cluster suicides. There was a copycat effect, but there was also this generational trauma. And many of these, it started with some young monks at Kirti Monastery. And many of them had grandparents who had fought the Chinese communists or who had died in prison or who had died of starvation. And it was all these traumas that had been, repressed for generations.
Right.
Spilling out. I mean, the immediate cause, if we don't have many other questions, I mean,
I have actually quite a few questions now. Needless to say, it always happens. They all come up with dozens of questions at the end.
A part of, again, there's this relationship where, you bring in more security and security brings in unrest. Naba was quite peaceful in the 90s and the early aughts. Even there were some, but this part of Tibet was relatively free. People taught in Tibetan, the monastery schools growing. There were some stuff, but not much. And in advance of the Olympics, there was a huge amount of development, new roads, the river Lhasa, and more security. And as they brought in more security, they got in more unrest, and they started exerting more control over the monasteries. Forcing monks go through this patriotic education and to disavow the Dalai Lama. And it was sort of, you know, you have the chicken and egg thing. You get more oppression, more unrest. And in March of 2008, protests broke out in Lhasa and all through the Tibetan plateau. And there were 20 odd people killed in Nava. It was the largest uprising outside of Lhasa. One of them was the niece of somebody it was just a schoolgirl.
Right, yeah, in the book, yeah.
In my book. And then the self-immolations started, you know, there was one, then another to commemorate the deaths the previous year, and then it just called.
Let me move on to the book. Somebody, Robin Ewing has asked, how does reporting from China and Tibet compare to reporting on North Korea? Which is an interesting question. And somebody, and I think this is a sort of, you can connect this, somebody has asked about protecting your local drivers and sources, because that is also obviously a very key part of what we do as journalists. So maybe you can answer those two questions.
You know, many of us have been saying China is becoming more like North Korea. I mean, it's not quite there yet, but there are similarities. And by the way, my North Korea book, which is set in the city of Chongjin, I did that all remotely.
Yeah.
You know, I went to quite a few times and did interviews there. But it, you know, it's similar, and you know, again, you're afraid for the people who you're interviewing and the people who are working with you. You know, there's just Han Chinese just have much more leeway, and you know, if I had a Chinese driver, you know, who has the police and blah blah blah, you know, he's like, I didn't know, and you know, we don't actually tell them exactly what we're doing. You know, they're just not
right. So you can protect in that way.
Trouble. But you know, a Tibetan, you know, it's just whatever, just the what's allowable for a Han Chinese person even now is like much greater than what's allowable for a Tibetan. And you know, so we have to be very mindful.
Yeah, absolutely. Somebody else has asked, this is a very interesting question. How do the young Tibetans, you know, like the ones who rushed up to your car to give you the gifts of Dalai Lama, how do they know about the Dalai Lama? So, and given that you've got the, you know, what we call the Great Firewall of China and the attempt of some very pervasive censorship by the Chinese Communist Party, how do they know all this stuff?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
You know, until recently there was a lot on WeChat.
Yeah.
You know, a lot on Weibo. A lot of WeChat groups and that sort of stuff. And, you know, he is their spiritual leader, and they all know, you know, during the 80s, books used to come in from India and from, you know, the US, or from journalists, or they get stuff. I mean, it's the same as, you know, anybody in Beijing or Shanghai. People are clever. They're clever about using the internet, and you know, it's a whack-a-mole game of, you know, tries to get it off. But you know, they can't cut off the Dalai Lama because the older generation knows as well.
And I'm presuming so this just passes down through the demonstration. If somebody has asked an interesting question here, Molly. Which one do you consider a bigger threat to Tibetan culture, brainwashing by the Communist Party or urbanization? Or maybe you don't consider those to be a threat. Maybe that's not what comes out of your book and your experience. I don't know.
I actually don't consider brainwashing more. I don't consider urbanization to be as much of a threat, because I mean, there are Tibetans who, you know, it depends urbanization for what purpose. You know, there's this, you know, ongoing effort to, I can never sedentarize the Tibetans, you know, get them into permanent homes, and, you know, that there's the whole business where they, you know, try to get them to give up their lands and their animals, and they give them these like crummy houses with 4 walls, and then they have them, you know, sign promissory notes and then they have no way of making a living because they've given up their animals. That's not so great. And as you know, probably most of the people here have spent some time in China. It's all about the environment and protecting the grasslands, and that's true. It's true. There is erosion of the grasslands, but it's not the primary problem. I mean, as we know, in Beijing, when they're cracking down on pollution, you have these coal-fired plants and traffic on the ring road. So they're always, but it's that guy Mohammed with his shish kebabs. That's causing pollution. They like, it's his like bar stand that's causing the pollution. So they, if it's urbanization for Tibetans, creating real jobs and nice homes, it would be a good thing. And this is a point of misunderstanding often between Tibetans and well-intentioned Han Chinese. They'll pull out the numbers and say, look at how much the central government has spent on infrastructure in Tibet and this and that, and transit. And yes, this is true. But this infrastructure is for Han Chinese. The nice homes are for Han Chinese. You take Tibet Airways sometime. There's there are not that many Tibetans on there. There's some, but it's for Chinese going to Lhasa. Tibetans often don't have the paperwork to avail themselves of this, and the difference between the Tibetan housing and the Chinese housing is just really dramatic.
It's very so. Simply because I've got another question here from David Robinson, and I think this is very interesting. It says, can you discuss any of this with ordinary mainland Chinese to open up the space around the subject of Tibet or Xinjiang for thinking beyond official narratives? It's interesting because I can remember in 2008 when there was the uprising. I remember I had a very close Chinese friend, and I can remember walking round and round Rutan Park, and it was the only time that she and I have had a major argument. And we just argued and argued and argued, and she said, we're doing everything we can for the Tibetans. They were feudal, they were backward, and we're bringing them up, and you don't understand, and you project your Western views onto Tibetans, and you want them to be backward, you want them to be poor. And we had this massive argument. I don't know, have you had those kind of arguments with Han Chinese friends?
I've had a couple of Chinese friends have read my book and liked it, but they're kind of intellectual types.
Sure.
I haven't, but I've heard that argument from many Chinese, intelligent Chinese, and I'm really hoping that this book is read by Chinese people, because I've tried to avoid the kind of, like the Chinese did this, the Chinese did that.
Yeah.
It's members of the Chinese Communist Party did this and did that. I had the same thing. I worked in the Middle East, and it was always like the Jews did this and the Jews did that. It's not
exactly.
But Netanyahu government. Yeah. So I don't, and I don't see this. I've done a lot of ethnic war in my career. I started in the Balkans. I don't see this as a traditional, ethnic conflict. Many of the people in my book are married to Han Chinese, and marriage is much more common than it is among the Uyghurs. I suppose for religion, it's just not a big deal religiously. And I'm not like, there's Tibetans who hate the Chinese, but it's not like in the same way. It's so I don't, they don't say really offensive things about them, and I feel like they're somewhere in their possibilities. And something that I haven't talked about with the self-immolations. I mean, the self-immolations are by nature very tied into Tibetan ideas of nonviolence.
Right.
The people who self-immolated were, most of them left notes or tapes and, said, I need to express, the depth of my feeling, but I don't want to hurt anybody else. Did not, for the most part, attack Han Chinese. And in fact, in Naba, from the time that I was writing about post 60s, 70s, I couldn't find one case of a Tibetan killing somebody Chinese. Now, I'm sure it happened. There had to be guys with knives and bars because, the Tibetans are not all nonviolent.
Sure.
There's a lot of fights with knives, but I didn't know of any cases. And, it happened in Lhasa, but not Naba. And, talking to people about the protests in Naba in 2008, there was some discussion of, should we, go after Chinese people? And they did burn many shops. I don't know of any Chinese individuals who were hurt seriously. Might have happened.
Right. Okay. That's interesting.
By the Chinese press, so it's very, it's a strange situation.
Yeah. So what another question which has come in, which is a classic question but a very important one: what happens when the Dalai Lama dies?
I think the Chinese Communist Party will try to appoint their own Dalai Lama. They'll look at some cute pink-cheeked little boy who they feel that they control, and the Tibetan exile government will name a successor Dalai Lama, and I think they'll, the same. I don't want to go into the whole long thing, but the same thing that happened with the Panchen Lama, and then
where they appointed their own Panchen Lama, who Tibetans really have no respect for. But of course, the real Panchen Lama, we don't even know what really happened to him, do we?
No, we don't. They post the Tibetan in the Tibet area of India, saying like the world's youngest political prisoner, but he was.
But do you think that the love of the Dalai Lama? Obviously you have a reincarnation issue, but will there be do you think that there'll be a sort of a power that the Dalai Lama has, or the love of the Dalai Lama will change once he passes into another body, who may not even be so well known who it is?
The current Dalai Lama, there have been better and worse Dalai Lamas. No matter what you think of the system, the Dalai Lama has been a very beloved Dalai Lama, like him or not. He's a very charismatic figure, and it's really been his message of nonviolence that has kept Tibet relatively quiet these last decades. And a lot of Tibetans feel like he's naive and he's let the Chinese roll over him. There are a lot of Tibetans who disagree with him politically. Doesn't mean they don't love him. Disagree. And he's one of the last generation who had real involvement with the Chinese. He met Mao. He met Xi Jinping's father. Xi Jinping's father, almost to his death, used to wear a watch that was given to him by the young Dalai Lama.
How amazing. That's so interesting.
His mother was apparently a Tibetan Buddhist. So there was an affinity there. And, the Dalai Lama told me, as he's told many other journalists, that he considered himself a socialist, to some. This is the affinity between Tibetan Buddhism and, sort of the more idealistic strand of socialism. So I maybe I'm naive, but I just think it's a pity they were not able to make accommodations with him. There was just a period under Hu Yaobang where Hu Yaobang basically, apologized and said, we did bad things in the 60s, but we're
that's a what if, isn't it? Yeah. Barbara, I've just looked at the clock and I realized that the time has gone by so quickly. And thank you so much for talking to us. To the audience, I would say I highly recommend this book. I really enjoyed it, and it gave me a sense and a feeling for Tibetans, which I hadn't had from other books I've read. Now, I have to remind you that this event will be available to watch on demand until the end of November, and in 48 hours, Chinese subtitles will be added. It's not the end of the Hong Kong Literary Festival. It runs until the 15th of November, and this has been a great event. I'm so glad I got back from America in time to do it, Barbara. And all it remains me to say is please buy the book. It's an excellent book. And thank you to the Hong Kong Literary Festival for having this event. And goodbye.
Thank you.